All right, welcome back, y'all. This is going to be Asian Politics, Lecture 2. This is going to be on the Chinese Revolution, which is Chapter 3. So we'll jump into the intro. Basically, 1912 sees the collapse of the imperial Chinese system, which had lasted for thousands of years. There were a couple reasons for this. One was really bad economic governance. Traditional agriculture was failing as sort of the industrial revolution is rising. China loses the opium wars to Britain. Britain is growing opium in India and forcing China to purchase it. Um, China wanted to sell their own opium. They lose, and as a result, they have to give up Hong Kong until 1999. And they're forced to pay reparations as well. So things are not going well in China in the early 20th century. Confucianism, as sort of a model for governance, also sort of falls out of power shortly thereafter, around 1920. And this is around the time of the victory of the Bolsheviks in Russia. And so the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party sort of partner up and get rid of the Confucian model as they govern. Okay, section 2, the Chinese brand of communism. So Marx, of course, calls for the Industrial Revolution, right? He calls for um, the bourgeoisie amassing so much political and economic power during the rise of industrialization that industrial labor and urbanized labor will sort of revolt against the state, right, or revolt against the bourgeois, and eventually have a sort of utopian communist takeover, right? Um, but industrialism barely exists in China, right? And so China much more revolves its own political communist philosophy around Leninist philosophy, around the Russian Revolution, right? Because Russia was also a highly, highly agrarianized society, and they had somehow figured out how to empower the rural agrarian society rather than a sort of urbanized industrial society, right? And so this provided a much better model for the Chinese system. Um, Chiang Kai-shek, who will lead the Kuomintang, the KMT, for a very long time, and is eventually exiled to Taiwan, which is why Taiwan is still so touchy today. But Chiang Kai-shek takes power of the Kuomintang in 1924. This is a big moment in Chinese history. The Kuomintang, the KMT, turns toward establishing geographic control in the north over sort of all the what they called warlords, and eventually toward the Communist Party, who they also sort of deemed to be warlords, right? The Kuomintang eventually, towards the 1930s, starts to become very, very elitist and highly, highly urbanized. Um, and they were lucky because economics were rather favorable to them during the 1920s, right? This is a booming period for the world economy. Um, but the Great Depression, of course, in the early 1930s causes a massive collapse and a huge famine, and millions die of starvation in 1931. The state starts to fall apart, and the economy turns towards sort of banditry and mass opium export, mass opium production for export. Right, a lot of the agricultural system turned toward opium, as we've also seen in places like Afghanistan, when their economy just completely collapses. And so the Americans during World War II sort of turned toward China rather than Japan, and backed the Chinese against the Japanese during World War II, whereas the Chinese had allied themselves with Italy and not just Germany. Um, the Kuomintang, however, decided that, you know what, we're just going to let the Americans fight the Japanese. And so the communists and the Americans actually fought the Japanese as one of the reasons for the rise of the Communist Party, because the Kuomintang was sort of harrying the communists and trying to establish control over the hinterland, basically, whereas they should have been much more focused on the Japanese invasion. Okay, section 3, the rise of the Communist Party, the CCP. Um, at this time, during the sort of Sino-Japanese War, a lot of the Kuomintang's advice was coming from the Comintern. I know Kuomintang and Comintern sound familiar, but they're not the same. The Comintern from Russia was sort of the internal political apparatus led by the elites like Stalin. And their advice was largely crafted towards Russia rather than China, right? And it was poorly crafted at best, and often was crafted against China's own interest to the benefit of Russia. Uh, so Mao Zedong sort of rises up inside the Communist Party because at this time the KMT and the CCP had sort of a tenuous alliance. Mao Zedong rises up and says, we need a much more agrarian model. We need to start ignoring the Comintern's advice and putting in sort of policy that helps us, not Russia. And so Mao Zedong, at this year or at this really early stage in the early 1930s, allies with a man named Zhou Enlai, who becomes the sort of general of the entire Chinese military, the Red Army Commissar in 1933, and they are like best friends for life, right? Until eventually Mao dies, I think in 1976, and then Zhou Enlai dies very shortly thereafter. Um, the Chinese Communist Party becomes a lot more outspoken against the Kuomintang and urbanism, and they start really blaming them for being elitists, basically, like, kind of like in here in America, right? Like the conservatives, blaming sort of the coastals as sort of, elitist education, blah blah blah. Well, it's sort of the same thing here, where the Communist Party of the agrarians was pushing against the Kuomintang had become highly elitist and urbanized. So the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai shek began to hunt down communists basically as bandits at this point. And after numerous campaigns by the Kuomintang, the KMT, against the communists, the CCP, the communists basically found themselves completely surrounded in 1934 and 1935, and they break out um, and they start what was called the Long March. And this was a year-long march northward. It lasted from October of 1935 to October of, 1934 to October of 1935. About 90 to 95% of everyone died on the way of starvation, of disease, but also of being sort of hunted down by the Kuomintang the entire way. Um, and then Chiang Kai shek actually wanted to sort of just again surround them and wipe them out of China. But unfortunately for him, the Xi'an incident occurs, right? And he is taken hostage by his own generals who are furious that he is fighting Chinese rather than the Japanese. So they take him hostage and they basically make him make an alliance with the Communist Party. And they come to this really tenuous alliance to fight the Japanese as Mao sort of begins his rise in the Communist Party. Section 4 focuses on China and World War II. I would just point out here that this alliance kind of bites Chiang Kai shek and the KMT in the ass because they give the Communist Party credit basically for fighting the Japanese. They were very heroic against the Japanese with the Americans, apparently. It gave them territory, right? As they took over territory from the Japanese, it gave them a base. And it also weaponized them. They had basically lost all their weaponry. They were in tatters at the end of the Long March, and this sort of tenuous alliance with the KMT strengthened them massively. Um, uh, uh, in addition to this, Chiang Kai shek was a terrible leader. He was a terrible economic leader. He was a terrible military leader. The Kuomintang often got their butts whooped by the Japanese, whereas the communists held their own for the most part. And so Chiang Kai shek is losing prestige as the years go on, and Mao Zedong is rising fast in prestige, right? The final section is the People's Republic of China. Japan is finally defeated, and a newly armed and very strengthened Communist Party, and a diminishing Kuomintang set upon each other in this really just brutal and devastating civil war. Mao Zedong eventually wins, and the communists win, and they institute what's called the People's Republic of China in 1949. At this point, Chiang Kai shek and the Kuomintang are exiled to Taiwan, and they have been in Taiwan ever since with American protection, basically. But also under a very tenuous agreement that there is a one China policy, which which capital controls that China has never sort of been outspoken by America. They say, yes, there is a one China policy. China says, well, that's Beijing. And America just sort of is like, well, yes, there's a one China policy. We're not going to say it's Beijing, right? But we're also not going to say it's Taiwan. So it's a really touchy subject. All right, that's all I got for lecture 2. I'll see you here shortly. Have a great day.